The Jeffrey Dahmer Tapes versus the Jeffrey Dahmer Netflix show. With the recent release of the Jeffrey Dahmer show on Netflix, which starred Evan Peters depicting the evil individual, and with the even more recent release of the never-before-heard tapes of Jeffrey Dahmer being aired, I thought I'd compare the two pieces of television that were recently released on Netflix, and see how accurate the show was compared to the true tellings of events that occurred by the people involved in the case. So let's get into it. Here is the Jeffrey Dahmer Tapes versus the Jeffrey Dahmer Netflix show. Both of these shows are on Netflix, so it would be safe to assume that most of the things that occurred in the limited series would be true to what was being told in the show that contained the tapes of the interviews with Dahmer between July and October of 1991, in the year in which he got caught. The limited series focused on Dahmer's years from when he was younger up until he was caught, jailed, and killed, and the tapes did a similar thing, but mainly spanned across asking questions of the time that he was in his killing spree, along with focusing on the trial of Dahmer, which was something that we didn't get to see that much of in the show, so it did provide more of a light to what occurred there. From the off, when listening to the tapes of Dahmer, it was clear to see that Evan Peters nailed the voice of Jeffrey. The pitch of the voice, the inflections, and the small nuances were down to a T, and it was creepy how similar it was to the real thing. Another element that the limited series nailed extremely well was the way that they set the apartment out. When looking at the real photos of Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment in the show that contained the tapes, it looked spot on to how it was laid out on set. The way his bedroom was structured with the television on the set of drawers, the fish tank on the back wall, along with the overall mood of his apartment, I was impressed to see how spot on it was. The Jeffrey Dahmer tapes focused on telling a linear story through the use of interviews that were being done. So it touched on Dahmer's childhood, where we heard how he'd dissect and look at roadkill, like we saw was apparent in the Netflix show. We heard of his disruptive childhood in the sense that his mother and father would argue a lot of the time, and also the one occasion that he dissected a pig when he was in school, and he then took it home with him, all things that we saw appear on screen during the Monster series. They were the only real times that it touched on Dahmer's childhood. We didn't hear of the time that he gave his school teacher tadpoles, and then later went to destroy them, or anything else that he really got up to as a child that was depicted in the limited series, despite the fact that it was true. Instead, the tapes cut forward to around the time of his first killing of Stephen Hicks. We heard about how his mother and father divorced when he was around 18 years old, and that his mother then later went on to abandon Jeffrey in the family home, leaving him there for months without his father realizing, which is what we saw in the series. However, in the true events that occurred when his father came back to the home and found Dahmer surrounded by bottles, it turned out that he was actually speaking with Dahmer a few times a week, whereas in the limited series it was made out like his father had not been speaking with him at all. However, one thing that was true was the fact that Lionel wasn't aware of the fact that his mother had left Dahmer alone. Along with this, we heard that he killed Stephen Hicks in the way that was told to us in the show containing Evan Peters. But it was the events that followed after that were slightly different. We saw the police car stop him for swerving, with Hicks' dismembered body being in bags in the back of the car, and from there he was then put inside of a container outside of his house, where the bags were kept for 3 years whilst Dahmer went off to college where he was failing his grades, and also when he was in the army but got kicked out due to his drinking. This wasn't made clear in the limited series, and it was made out like he got rid of the body after returning home that night, so there was a slight difference there. From here, there were a few more facts that were included, such as Dahmer moving into his grandmother's house, him staying late at a shopping mall and taking a mannequin and performing acts on it when he was back at his bedroom. We found out in the show containing the tapes that he was extremely interested in torsos, which is something that wasn't made clear in the series, but it did certainly allude to. Dahmer moving into the apartments after leaving his grandmother's house after also seeing that he'd take some of his victims back there and then go on to eventually kill them there was also something that we saw present in both of the shows. Most of what we saw in the apartment and the events that occurred there were present in both of the shows. The several locks that were described to be on Dahmer's door, the encountering of Tracy Edwards who managed to escape after being forced to watch The Exorcist and having photos taken, and also the neighbors complaining about the smell that was coming from his apartment. One big difference in the dramatization was the fact that Glenda wasn't the neighbor that lived directly next door to Dahmer. She lived in a building across the street, so a lot of what Glenda went through in the limited series wasn't something that occurred in real life. However, there was truth behind it, in the sense that her daughter did find Conrack on the street and was concerned with how he was returned to Dahmer's apartment, and she did consistently phone the police to ensure that he was okay and to make sure that they did the right thing. Instead, in the show that was centered around the tapes, it was focused more on a neighbor called Vernal and his wife Pam. The two officers that returned Conrack were dismissed like we saw in the series. Their comment on the radio about needing to delouse was also something that actually occurred, along with them eventually being reinstated. One thing that felt like it wasn't made that large of a deal of in the limited series was the uproar that the police faced for the way that they handled the situation that sadly resulted in Conrack being killed. As well, the sheer amount of support that was there for the police officers and the force, which ultimately led to the officers being reinstated, which did happen in real life. In the show with Evan Peters, we saw that Tony Hughes had been meeting with Jeffrey on a regular basis, which was something that was true to events. However, one thing that we weren't made aware of was the fact that Dahmer tried to make Tony one of his living zombies like he did with Conrack. The sense of loneliness and Dahmer not wanting the individuals to leave him was something that was at the core of why he was doing what he was doing, as he didn't want to be alone, and he was an extremely lonesome individual. Whilst it was incorporated into the limited series, I wouldn't say it was made as much of a focus as to what it was in the show that contained the tapes. He didn't want them to leave that much to the point where he'd kill them, so he'd always be with them, and he'd keep body parts as a memory of them. Elements such as the photography, the crushed up sleeping pills, the zombie-like state, and the listening to individual stomachs were all things that were present in both shows, along with the carrying out of acts on unconscious or deceased individuals. But one thing, such as the actual dissection of individuals and getting aroused by that, was something that was left out of the main series, and I'm not surprised as that would have been extremely graphic. When it came to the trial, we mainly saw the closing statements from the families of the victims, which were essentially word for word as to how they were actually done. But in the show centered around the tapes, we saw slightly more than that. We saw the battle that the defense lawyer was facing in trying to get Dahmer to be found as insane, which was something that didn't end up coming to be, and instead he was found as sane when carrying out what he did. When it came to Dahmer's time in jail, he was kept in a cell by himself, and wasn't able to be amongst the general population for his own safety, which was something that we didn't really see in the limited series that much. But he took it upon himself to want to be able to be around other people, which was ultimately what led to him being killed. John Wayne Gacy being executed on the day that Dahmer was baptized and there being an eclipse was all true. The eventual killing of Dahmer in the gym whilst he was on cleaning duty was also true as well. In the limited series, it was made out as though there was a guard that was in on allowing Christopher Scarver to kill him, but in reality this wasn't the case. This was included in the show because in real life, and as was mentioned in the other show, it was crazy how the situation even would have been able to have happened, as there were always guards watching every move that an inmate made. I would say that the show starring Evan Peters stuck true to the events that actually occurred, and most of it was backed up in the tapes that were spoken from Dahmer's mouth, legal representatives, or officers at the time. From his childhood, to him fantasizing about the runner before he'd done anything, to the reasoning behind why he was carrying out the gruesome acts leading him to become the evil individual, it was all incorporated in both of the shows. There was the occasional element of fiction amongst it, but in terms of the horrific nature of the events that occurred, a lot of it were facts. So, there you have it, the Jeffrey Dahmer Tapes versus the Jeffrey Dahmer Netflix show. If you want to see more videos such as endings explained, theories and predictions, and character breakdowns, then click on the I button. Or alternatively, you can head over to my channel where you'll find them all. If you'd like to give me a show or movie that you'd like me to review, then head over to my Twitter, @brainpilot_, and tweet me what show or movie you'd like me to review next. And finally, if you'd like to see what I rate the latest movies that don't quite make the cut to getting a dedicated video, then head over to my Letterboxd profile. It's where I rate the latest releases in real time. Do you think the show was true to the facts? Leave a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.